Hello, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer, and this is my first YouTube video ever. So, right off the bat, thank you so much for watching. We are going in this channel to be talking a lot about the modern format of Magic the Gathering. We're going to do a lot of gameplay footage, and we're going to do a few deck techs. This footage and these deck techs will be focused generally on my favorite archetypes in Modern, which, subject to change, but at the moment are Taking Turns, which is a rogue deck that just really speaks to me, and the BGX midrange decks of the format. I'm not so much a fan of red as a color, so while I do like Jund, it's a little bit lower on the list than Abzan and Golgari, also known as Black Green Rock. Now, of the latter two, I am of the opinion that Golgari is particularly well positioned in the format right now, and that will only become more true as Assassin's Trophy enters the meta, which it is due to join us in just a couple weeks here. So today will be a deck tech on the Black Green Rock version of these BGX decks, or at least one way to play it. We've got a lengthy rundown ahead, so get comfortable, uh, get hydrated, and strap in because we're gonna go pretty deep. Now, I really want this to be beginner friendly, so if you're a veteran player, please forgive me for stating the obvious, but I also hope to be able to offer some insight, even to veterans of the archetype. And if you are a newer player, welcome. And if some of the synergies that I mentioned don't quite make sense, or if anything goes over your head, fear not, because all will become clear in time. You've just gotta get some reps in with the deck, and a lot of it becomes second nature from there. So let's hop right in. Why are we playing a black-based mid-range deck in Modern? Well, it's because we want to interact. We play some of the best spot removal in the format in the form of Fatal Push. We play some discard spells, Thoughtseize being the most iconic one, which these discard spells are probably the biggest attraction to playing a black mid-range deck in the first place. They are kind of a format policeman in that it doesn't really matter what the opponent is up to, aggro, combo, mid-range, control, or prison. Discard can, in theory, interact with them efficiently. Now, it's going to be better in some matchups than others, like anything else, but these discard spells are a big reason to play a deck like this. They're very skill testing, they're very fun to use, and they're a positive influence on the format in terms of keeping things in check. Now, we're interacting, but we also need to win the game. So being in green-black allows us to play cards like Tarmogoyf, which just reward you for playing the game. This guy, most games will become a 4-5 or a 5-6, maybe even larger, without you really having to build around him at all. Like, you do consider the Tarmogoyf's ability when you're constructing a deck, but it's not like he's dependent on all these tribal synergies or these weird combos. You just interact, you just play the game, and he gets bigger and bigger, and eventually you turn him sideways and kill the opponent. It's pretty cool. We also get to play Modern's most iconic Planeswalker, Liliana of the Veil. We get to play a lot of really cool sideboard cards, and in this particular build, we don't have Dark Confidant. Some people are kind of down on the Confidant in Modern. I'm actually not one of them. I think that Bob is still perfectly legitimate, but this particular build eschews him in favor of Tireless Tracker, which is a kind of innocuous looking card, but a really, really absurdly powerful source of card advantage in this deck. So that's the quick overview. Now, we're going to go line by line through the cards. The other thing before we do that I'd like to point out is that we're playing 25 lands. Now, 25 is quite a high land count. It really is for a mid-range deck. 23 is pretty common for a lot of them. 24 is a high number. Now, some Jund decks have been playing 25 if they run the full 4 Bloodbraid Elf and all that, but we're not. We don't play anything that costs over 3 to cast. Even Tasigur will almost always be cast for 3 mana or less. So why are we playing so many lands? Well, that is because Tireless Tracker um, is kind of a build-around card here. We are turning what would otherwise be dead draws, flooding out on too many lands, into extra cards, which in turn make the tracker grow into a threat that can genuinely close out the game. Again, this card looks really innocuous on paper, but in the context of the deck, it's really, really good. So, 25 lands. Number one, it helps feed the tracker. Number two, it gives us wiggle room to accommodate 6 basic lands, which is very important in a format with Blood Moon, Path to Exile, Field of Ruin, Ghost Quarter, Settle the Wreckage, and soon to be Assassin's Trophy. We want as many basics as we can realistically afford. And we have 9, count them, 9 utility lands. Some are land destruction, some are what we call man lands, which are lands that can be animated. They're kind of dual purpose. First, they help you cast your spells, and then you turn them into creatures that help you win the game, or stay in the game, as the case may be. So, 25 lands. It's a high land count, but there is a rhyme and a reason to it. So, what lands are we playing? We'll begin by looking at this one, Blooming Marsh. Pretty much a free inclusion as a 4-of in here. During the 3 most crucial turns, it comes in untapped, it's totally painless, and it makes us both colors. What more do we need? This land is great. No reason not to play 4 of them, in my opinion. Now, you do want to use your mana effectively turns 4 and beyond, so it can be a little annoying when this enters tapped on turn 4 or turn 5. Maybe you want a 2-spell turn, maybe you want to crack a clue and play a spell. You just don't know. So this is not without its drawbacks, but its drawbacks are perfectly acceptable. Moving on, we are playing 4 Verdant Catacombs, the fetch lands in our colors. This, again, is a pretty free inclusion. It gets us exactly what we want when we want it. It can fetch the Overgrown Tomb, which is a shock land in our colors, or it can fetch either basic. And it also helps fill up the graveyard, which is very important for several different synergies that we will get into as we go on. Verdant Catacombs also serves as 2 landfall triggers for Tireless Tracker. So you get a clue when you play the fetch land, and then you get a clue when you crack the fetch land. It's a beautiful thing. For that reason, it's actually quite reasonable to play 5 or even 6 fetch lands in a deck like this. You can certainly accommodate it, but the 5th and beyond are not as good as the first 4 because only Verdant Catacombs can get either swamp or forest, and there will be games, plenty of games, where you want to get basics. The other reason to stay down at 4 is, again, so we can accommodate all of these beautiful utility lands. So that's the reasoning behind that. I've already mentioned Overgrown Tomb. This is our fetchable dual land. You'll want to, if you're in a position where you're just going to do the whole crack the fetch land at the opponent's end step play, and you're not planning to use your mana for anything, you'll generally want to get the tomb. That just means you don't draw it later. It means you're having your most painful land enter the battlefield on your own terms. You get it tapped and you never have to pay that 2 life. And it also means you leave the basic lands in your deck, which is quite useful, again, against all of those cards that, Path to Exile, Settle the Wreckage, and so on and so forth. Cards that do really good things against you, but give you the upside of a basic land. So you don't want to leave that upside on the table. Um, Onto our basics, we play 6. You could even quite easily fit in a 7th. My list here is partially influenced by the list Jeff Hoagland runs, so credit to him. He plays basic number 7, which is a 5th swamp, and that is perfectly acceptable. He plays that instead of a Field of Ruin. There are lots of tweaks that could be made. A lot of it is preference. I think 6 is enough for now. Maybe if Assassin's Trophy pushes us to 7, that's okay. But for now, I like 6. And even though our mana costs are relatively evenly distributed between black and green, we want the 4th swamp over the 3rd forest because, number 1, we need black mana on turn 1. At all costs, we need black mana on turn 1 most games. And we'll often, for Liliana and Liliana, we'll need that double black on turn 3. So playing too many basic forests can prevent us from reaching those thresholds. So the 4-2 split is beautiful. We've got some good old-fashioned Onslaught artwork by John Avon and Pete Venters. These are beautiful lands. You can't go wrong. So onto the utility lands. We have a full 4 copies of Field of Ruin. Now this is a little ambitious. Wouldn't be surprised if it was just better to play 3 and be a little less aggressive on this front. But you know what? We can accommodate it. It's definitely not too bad to try the full 4. And I've had mixed results. I had a good run of games where my mana was so smooth I never once had an issue. More recently, I've had some games where my opening hands have been clunked up by too many fields, too many man lands, too many basics. We've got lots and lots of upside from playing this land, however. It is an absolute all-star in the format. This is our answer to Azcanta the Sunken Ruin. It's our answer to opposing manlands. It is just so good, and it helps fix our own mana on occasion because we get to search up a basic of our choosing. The fact that that basic enters untapped lets us even fire this off, for example, turn 3 main phase, and then play an Inquisition or a Thoughtseize after it. And last but not least, it lets us have a second landfall trigger off of Tireless Tracker. So we've got lots and lots of reasons to run this card. Again, 4 might be a little ambitious, but it's certainly feasible. Moving on, we have 5 man lands, 5 creature lands. These are, that's quite a high count for such things in Modern. Again, that 25 overall land count is really what facilitates this. First and foremost, we have Hissing Quagmire. Now, just to be fully upfront with you, this is not one of the best man lands in Modern. It is no Celestial Colonnade, it is no Raging Ravine, and it's no Mutavault really either. But it is the man land in our colors, and that's why we're playing it, and that's why we're playing 3. The first priority of lands is to make mana to cast spells. Again, I don't want to state the obvious, but it is worth remembering that. So Hissing Quagmire does that. It can be a little clunky because it enters tapped, but generally with some clever sequencing, you can mitigate that pretty much entirely. And it's 3 mana to activate. It's only a 2/2. Again, not that impressive. Death Touch, though. Death Touch is a relevant keyword. It has proved to be more relevant than I thought it would when I first started playing this land. So definitely not, I don't want to undersell Hissing Quagmire. It is a fine choice, and there are many games where we interact so well that it almost doesn't matter what you win the game with. You can turn this one sideways just as well as you can turn anything else sideways. And it's a good defensive play too. Treetop Village is our other man land. Now this one is a little bit more impressive. For 2 mana, you activate it, it becomes a 3/3. Now that's much better than 3 mana for a 2/2. It's also got Trample, which I would say on average is more relevant than Death Touch. When you fire up the manlands, it usually means you're starting to close out the game. You're starting to really get aggressive, and being able to trample over chump blockers is quite powerful. Now, so why are we playing only 2 Village and 3 Quagmire if this is a better manland? Again, we go back to the mana issues. This makes green only, and it enters the battlefield tapped, so it's a little underwhelming as far as mana production goes. But again, that's why we're on 25 lands. We can consider these almost like spells in a way. And again, all of our excess lands not only facilitate all of this action from our lands, but they make the tireless tracker that much more reliable. So that's what our land base looks like. Moving on to the 1 mana spells. We have the full 4 copies of Fatal Push. This is a premier form of spot removal in Modern. It's the best card you can see in your opening hand against a lot of decks like Elves, frankly, most tribal decks, humans. It's very good against Bant Spirits, even though they've got a few more ways to play around it. Against Elves, which I did already say, against really aggressive decks like 8-Whack, this is great against Infect. Like, any deck that plays creatures starting turn 1, you want Fatal Push. This is your no downside way to kill their early plays and maintain parity with them into the late game, where we will almost certainly be favored. That said, Fatal Push, it's a 4 of, but these are going to be 4 dead cards in certain matchups. Think of an obvious one like Ad Nauseam. They don't play a single creature main deck except a Laboratory Maniac, which is an alternate win con that they will not be using against us. Less obvious cases are, if we're against a deck playing a lot of delve threats, or even a deck like Scred Red where they have a top end where everything costs 5, or gets value when it enters the battlefield. Fatal Push, this card is not going to do much against them, so we've got, it's very efficient and it's very good, but keep its limitations in mind as we go through the rest of the deck. Next, we come to the discard spells. Now, as I said, they are the big attraction to this deck. Again, they're like anything else, they're not great in every matchup, but these are the backbone of our interaction. We're playing 3 copies of Inquisition of Kozilek. This is a 1 mana 1/1, gives us hand information, takes away the key card. If you don't know what your enemy's up to, if it's a blind game 1, you want this card and you want to be on the play, and you want to be able to cast it, of course. That goes a long way to making whatever else happens acceptable, because the power of discard is real in Modern. It really, really is. Now, the downside of a card like this is, let's say you interact heavily, you run your opponent out of resources, you're both in top deck mode, and you promptly draw an Inquisition. That's quite bad. It's a dead draw. It's not completely dead forever because we have ways to kind of cash it in for value, but that is the downside of discard. However, the upsides are so strong that they make it well worth including at least 6 discard spells of these 1 mana variety. I think are pretty much mandatory in a deck like this. The companion to Inquisition is the even more iconic Thoughtseize. This does not suffer from Inquisition's restriction of 3 CMC or less. This can take anything as long as it's not a land. Pluck it out of the opponent's hand. Too bad, dude. You can't play that card anymore unless you get it back out of your graveyard somehow. Insanely powerful card. However, Thoughtseize has a downside of its own. You lose 2 life. Actually pretty bad. It's pretty bad against burn. It's pretty bad against a lot of the hyper aggro decks. So, not without its costs. However, our land base is so painless. We play some main deck life gain. We interact really well overall with aggressive strategies. So for that reason, I think the deck can accommodate a 3 in 3 split quite easily. A lot of people will play 4 Inquisition and only 2 Thoughtseize, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's one of these things that's not really quote unquote solved, but in this particular deck, I think 3 Thoughtseize is where it's at. We can quite easily accommodate that downside of losing 2 life in exchange for the power and flexibility of that as a 1 mana play. Moving on to the 2-drop slot, we have Cast Down. 2 mana instant, destroy target non-legendary creature. This just kind of rounds out our spot removal. It's kind of our 5th Fatal Push that kind of flexes into the spots where a Fatal Push can't reach against the delve threats, against the the primeval titans of the world. The big goons usually die to Cast Down. Keep the non-legendary clause in mind, though. It's not one that you see every day in Modern, so it can be easy to forget about, so keep that one in mind. Next up, we have a really interesting card, Collective Brutality. Now, this is one of my favorite cards in the entire game. This is another big attraction to be playing an interactive black mid-range deck. This is what we call a modal spell, meaning you can choose one mode or more, depending on the resources that you're willing to spend or have access to, and what of the modes seems good in the moment. So this can, buttress our discard effects by being yet another discard effect. It's limited, it only hits instants or sorceries, but that can still be absolutely amazing. For example, we've got a 3rd one in our sideboard. Pretty much the only reason you'd want to bring this in against a control deck is for that 1st mode, but we do. It's that good. It's really that useful. So discard mode is real. It kills a creature, toughness 2 or less. That is quite powerful as well. You would never pay 2 mana for a sorcery speed version of either of these effects, right? But the flexibility of the card and the fact that we can afford to main deck 2 of them here means that whereas a card like Fatal Push can be dead against certain decks, Inquisition can be dead if you top deck it after. Like, this card is never dead, and that's especially apparent when you read that last mode. Target opponent loses 2 life, you gain 2 life. That's kind of the floor of the card. Like, if you can get no other value out of this card, you just drain them for a 4-point life swing. It's really incredible to have that flexibility, and of course, you feel like a galaxy brain genius, when you resolve this card against Burn on turn 2 for all 3 modes. You kill the Goblin Guide, you drain them for 4, and you take a Boros Charm out of their hand. What could be better than that, right? So, absolutely amazing piece of technology, Collective Brutality. Escalating is how we fuel the additional modes beyond the 1st, and that's a real cost. So you'll have to learn when it makes sense to escalate aggressively and when you just want to say, okay, I'm not going to be greedy, I'm just going to play this for 1 mode. And it's a little underwhelming, but it can still be the right call. However, if you do end up escalating, that fills up our graveyard. Remember when I mentioned early on we want to fill up the graveyard? Well, we're entering into the period of the video where we talk about the reasons why. So first up, we have Scavenging Ooze. This card it's hard to really convey how strong this card is in this deck until you've actually used it. This is main deckable Grave Hate, it's main deckable life gain, and like most of our other threats, it is a threat that can single-handedly take over the game if left unchecked. So with Scavenging Ooze, we get to get value out of our own discards to escalation for brutality, to Liliana of the Veil +1, and just we get value out of our opponent removing our other creatures because the ooze can eat them and get bigger. But really, we want to be attacking our opponent's graveyard with this, all else being equal. We want to, um, get this guy up out of bolt range if you're up against a red deck. So while it is a 2-drop and it's a perfectly valid play on 2 a lot of the time, maybe you'll want to run out a different threat on turn 2 and try to play the ooze on turn 4 or turn 5, After a flurry of interaction, at the end of all that, when both opponents are just about out of resources, if you slam down the ooze, they have got to top deck an answer for him or he is just going to put the game away. Amazing, amazing card. But probably not quite as amazing as our next selection, which is the Tarmogoyf. Like I said in the intro, this card rewards you for simply playing Magic. The longer the game goes on, the bigger he's going to get, barring any grave hate. And he gets quite big, quite swiftly, and with alarming consistency. This card will almost never be less than a 4/5 if you're interacting against an average deck and they don't have grave hate. 5/6 is also fairly common. And beyond that, it certainly happens. It can be almost Death Shadow size, and we've got a lot of kind of fancy forms of interaction, but you do need to end the game, and you do prefer to end the game quickly. So this is our big dumb beater that does exactly that. Tarmogoyf is one of the most iconic creatures in Modern. Some have said that his time in the sun has passed a little bit. Actually, Fatal Push was considered to be a card that made Tarmogoyf much worse. It's one of the only clean 1-mana answers to him in the format most of the time. But this guy is still a king and a pillar of the format and is one of the most compelling reasons to be playing these colors in this style of deck. You can't go wrong with the GOAT. He's just that good. Rounding out our 2-mana threat suite is a lone copy of the Grimflayer. Now, I have to play this. My YouTube name is Grimflayer. What am I going to do? Not play a Grimflayer? Come on, that's not allowed. And, this is definitely the worst of the 3-mana threats in this deck, but it's still a card well worth including and well worth talking about. So nobody disputes the raw power level of the green-black cards, but what we do lack in this deck is card selection. We don't have Serum Visions, we don't have Faithless Looting, we don't have these cards that let us pick and choose what's right for a particular moment in a game. Grimflayer is the closest we can get to this without completely warping our deck. So if he connects, his damage trigger gives us a look at the top 3 cards of our library. It lets us put any number of them into the yard, which as we already know is amazing with other synergies in the deck, and leave whatever we want on top. So card selection, graveyard fuel, he's got evasion with trample. He sounds pretty good, right? So why only one of? Well, Grimflayer is a bit more of a build-around card in general. There are traverse builds of Golgari and Abzan and of Jund that lean really heavily on Grimflayer. They play Mishra's Bauble and other cards to accommodate him to achieve Delirium and with some consistency. Now, without building around him like that, in my opinion, he's pretty clearly outclassed by Tarmogoyf and Scavenging Ooze, but I like playing the first Flare before the 4th Scavenging Ooze. That'd be going a little bit too far. So Flare is a perfectly reasonable inclusion, and yeah, he's if you can connect once with him, he has earned his value in this deck. That is for sure. Finally, we have in the 2-drop slot a couple copies of Abrupt Decay. So this is a really interesting card. Can't be countered it is a relevant clause. It's perhaps not as relevant as you think because most of the decks playing counter Magic are not presenting 3 mana or less cost permanents for you to tag with the Decay. That said, it still definitely happens. It's still got a lot of targets in Modern where the converted mana costs tend to stay pretty low. Um, and even if the uncountered clause isn't relevant, the fact that this thing reaches in beyond creatures into artifacts and enchantments and even 3 mana planeswalkers is quite amazing. And its instant speed, it's got a lot to like. Now, that restriction is pretty real, which is why we're sticking only to 2. Again, this is a card that will be competing, at least to some degree, directly with Assassin's Trophy when Assassin's Trophy is printed. We won't talk too much about that right now, but until we have Trophy, I'm very happy with Decay as a 2-of in this deck. I'm just going to jump to the bottom of the 3 CMCs because the segue from Decay into Maelstrom Pulse makes a lot of sense. Maelstrom Pulse is kind of a cousin to Decay in a way. They're both the green-black interactive cards that branch out of hand attack and out of creature removal into being your catch-alls. Now, whereas Decay has a restriction, Pulse has no restriction, only non-land. That's the only restriction. And beyond that, it destroys all other permanents with the same name as the permanent that you target. Now, this card is completely incredible in Modern at the moment. You've got Bridgevine and all of these, and plenty of other decks, Mardu Pyromancer, decks that make a lot of tokens. You can effectively have a one-sided main deckable 3 mana sweeper against those decks in the form of Maelstrom Pulse. This thing also hits the big Planeswalkers, the big win conditions, and blue-white control in other decks. This thing also can sometimes just be a big clunky 1-for-1 removal spell against a creature. Doesn't sound very impressive, but in the context of our deck, if we've gotten some really efficient 1-for-1s or 2-for-1s already, sometimes the Maelstrom Pulse as just yet another 1-for-1 on top of that is enough to keep the board clear and keep our Tarmogoyf attacking, or whatever the case may be. Against tribal decks, you also get a fair amount of 2-for-1s with this. A savvy player will be aware of it and play around it to the extent that they're able, but they also can't really afford to slow roll threats against us, especially game 1 when we don't have board wipes, just in case we have a Maelstrom Pulse, you know? So you'll get your share of 2-for-1s and beyond with this card. I love it. Absolutely love it. Might as well just keep going up here. Tireless Tracker, I've already touched on a couple times, but let it be known, this card is the truth. This card is the nuts in this deck. Looks really vanilla, really slow, really kind of dirtily, and guess what? It is. That's okay. We have such good interaction early. We have such flexible interaction and standalone threats that our opponent will often be forced to, one way or another, whether we're taking them away or they're having to spend them, we might have a pretty good shot of running them out of resources by the time we hit the mid-game. Now, that's when it's Tireless Tracker's time to shine. Ideally, even though this is a 3-drop, we want to consider this a 4-drop. You want to play it on turn 4 by tapping 3 mana, playing the tracker, and then immediately playing a land afterwards. So even if they can deal with it, you have already gotten value via the clue. Now, that feels pretty bad for the opponent, right? They just got 2-for-1. Feels even worse for the opponent if they can't answer it, because this card will just run away with the game. It will bury them in value. Again, looks a little hard to believe perhaps if you're new to the archetype and you've never used this card in a highly interactive shell, but just give it a shot. I do not think you'll be disappointed in the Tireless Tracker. This card is amazing. Now, rounding out the 3 mana slot are Lilianas. Liliana of the Veil. Kind of the face of Modern in a lot of ways. Having to share the limelight a little bit lately with Jace the Mind Sculptor and now Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, but Liliana remains arguably the most powerful planeswalker in the format. You will hear some people say, yeah, Liliana's not at her best. Well, be that as it may, when Liliana was at her best, she was the proverbial first name on the team sheets. She was a guaranteed locked in 4 of no matter what else you were up to in a deck like this. So the fact that you quote unquote only play 3 of her sometimes now, 4 is still perfectly viable. Yeah, she's not as well positioned as she used to be, but she used to be the uncontested best planeswalker in the format, and it wasn't even close. So when you hear people say that, bear that in mind. She is still absolutely incredible. She is recursive disruption, and she's highly flexible. And even though her +1 is symmetrical, we can leverage it a lot better than the average opposing deck can. And her ultimate is backbreaking, absolutely backbreaking. So she is still a big payoff card, a big reason to be playing a deck like this in the modern format. 3 feels perfect right now. 4 is viable, though. 4 is still viable, in my opinion. However, in lieu of the 4th, I really like playing Liliana the Last Hope in the main deck. Now, as we saw with Liliana of the Veil, a lot of successful planeswalkers in Modern have similar templating. Liliana's a little bit, she doesn't quite fit the mold, but it's close enough. So they have a plus ability that's card advantage. In this case, it's card disadvantage, but you get the idea. And a minus ability that takes care of a threat on board. So Liliana of the Veil kind of fits this templating, but Jace the Mind Sculptor does, Teferi does, Chandra Torch of Defiance, you name it. If a Planeswalker is modern playable, it often has similar templating. The reason I mention that is because Liliana the Last Hope gets to tick up. She gets to +1 while killing a creature. Now, it's a very narrow ability in terms of killing a creature. It has to have 1 toughness only, but I just want it to sink in for you how powerful it is that she can tick up, she can gain loyalty while killing a creature. That is completely amazing. Now, if you don't have a creature that dies to that on the other side of the board, that's totally fine. You can still tick up and help stall out the board. She can work toward her ultimate, which is inevitability in terms of a win con. It's slow, but inevitable win through that eventually. But if you're ever in a position where you're against a deck where she can kill things with her +1, and you go turn 2 Tarmogoyf, turn 3 Last Hope, and kill something, they need an answer that turn, or she is just going to end the game. She's just going to bury them in too much value. Now, that's her ideal use case, but even in the mirror match, let's say, where we can't kill anything, her -2 is incredible. It's instant value. You self-mill, and then you return a creature card of your choice from your graveyard to your hand. It's really good. It's buying back a threat, and then she can tick up, and then she can go back down and do it again if need be. You can cash her in for 2 activations of that, kind of 2 Eternal Witnesses without leaving the body behind. It's really good. Really, really good. And worth quickly pointing out, the synergy with Fulminator Mage. Cast a Fulminator, destroy their land. Next turn, play Liliana the Last Hope, get the Fulminator back, do it again. Against a control deck, for example, that is absolutely going to win you the game if they cannot, if they can't keep up with it. It's really, really nice. Last but not least, we have Tasigur the Golden Fang. Now, when I first saw some of these lists playing 2 Tasigur, I will admit that before I tried them, I said, oh, that's an easy cut. I can cut a Tasigur. Why would I want 2? He's okay. But, legendary rule, yeah, why would I really want to? I can free up a slot. I'm happy to report that I was entirely wrong. This guy is low-key incredible in this deck. So the first thing to point out is that he almost never is cast for more than 3 mana. If you want to keep your graveyard intact, maybe it's turn 4, you don't have anything better to do, sure, you can tap 4 mana, delve away 2 cards, and there you go. But when you need him to be, this guy can come down as a 2-drop, effectively, or even as a 1-drop, but of course, his CMC is 6, so he's dodging opposing Fatal Pushes and Abrupt Decays and whatever else. So that is a nice place to be in the format. There are some progressions with this deck where you keep a really good 2-land hand. You know, you've got all the interaction you want, you've got a threat or 2. Let's say we've got one of them is Goyf and one of them is Tasigur, right? We've got all the interaction, we've got 2 lands, maybe we've got a 3-mana Planeswalker, and of course we're going to draw our 3rd land sometime in the first few turns. Why wouldn't we? We're a 25-land deck. Well, it doesn't always work out that way, so you could be in a position where you play a 1-mana spell on turn 1, a 2-mana on turn 2, and then you're stuck on 2 and you're stuck on 2, so you maybe have to just play a 1-mana spell on turn 3 while it's still good before it becomes dead in hand, but you're not using your mana effectively, and then you still don't draw land, you have to play another 2-mana spell, and you know, that can get really clunky, but after a few turns of that, even if you fail to draw out of it, you can play the Tasigur for 1 mana if you want to. It's really, the delve ability on this is really flexible. Now, his ability is icing on the cake. You're not going to activate his ability an enormous amount of the time, necessarily. It's more like, okay, if we're both in top deck mode and Tasigur is the only threat on the board, he's going to take over the game with repeated value from that ability. So that's an amazing, amazing thing in this deck, but don't feel obligated to just kind of fire off this ability whenever you can. It is perfectly acceptable to consider this guy as Tarmogoyf number 5 and 6. Everything else is just kind of gravy. So moving on, we've got moving to the sideboard. Now this is where the local metagame that you might be experiencing, the personal preferences, this is where they all really kick in. You can do all kinds of different things to what I'm doing here in the sideboard, and in fact, I will probably do some very different things the next time I take a good run at editing this deck, but for now, let's take a look at what I chose and why I chose it. So, to begin with, we have 3 different Wrath effects. We have Flaying Tendrils, which is a Wrath that's conditional in the sense that it kind of only hits weenies, but it's really good against recursive threats. Against Dredge, for instance, this is a hoser. And just against weenie decks in general, even when the graveyard does not matter much or at all, the fact that it's a 3-mana sweeper can be the difference between life and death. We've got Languish, which is an interesting one. It's 4 mana, and it's still conditional, so why are we playing this over the more unconditional, kill 'em all, damnation-style wraths? Well, because a lot of our threats will survive a Languish. Tarmogoyf is the obvious one. This card is a natural 4/5 a lot of the time, especially by the time it's turn 4. You can just play the Languish and your Goyfs will live. That's really, really good. And most things in the modern format will still be dying to Languish, especially because if they don't die to Languish, you're not going to bring it in. You activate Scavenging Ooze a few times, and it can survive a Languish too. Tasigur survives it. A couple clue cracks, and even your tracker can survive it. The poor Grimflayer, even if he's delirious, will fall to the Languish, but you know what? That's okay. Our Wraths don't need to be 3-for-1s, 4-for-1, 5-for-1 blowouts necessarily. That does happen, and that's really good. That's usually GG in a deck like this especially. But we interact so well on a fair 1-for-1 basis that sometimes just getting a 2-for-1 with any of these is enough to put the game away. Now, finally, we do have Damnation because sometimes you just want access to this unconditional destroy 'em all threat. It's also worth noting that the diversification of names among the three big sweeper effects is useful against Meddling Mage and humans. Now, whether Meddling Mage stays in against us, I don't really know. He seems a little medium, but it definitely doesn't hurt to have the variety there. Now, these two cards are also sweeper effects of a kind. First, let's talk about Golgari Charm. Now, this card is low-key incredible. It has become one of my absolute favorite sideboard cards in Golgari. It even has the thematic name, so we've got to play it, right? It can sweep up the weenies. It can sweep up the tokens. It can sweep up the monodorks. It can sweep up the elves. Whatever you're against, it can get them. And again, absolutely nothing in our deck is dying to this. We don't play Dark Confidant in this version. We don't play Lingering Souls. This is a true 1-mana, one-sided, 2-mana instant speed sweeper in the matchups where it's good. That in and of itself is quite shockingly powerful. Now, its other modes are actually quite relevant too. We've got Destroy Target Enchantment. Well, having a Naturalize effect that doesn't kind of clunkily take up a spot in our sideboard, that's pretty cool. It's not exactly a Naturalize effect because it can't hit artifacts, but you know what? We've got a lot of main deck ways to do that anyway. So that's perfectly acceptable trade-off. You bring this in against Blood Moon decks, against anything packing a lot of enchantments, it's perfectly legitimate to just bring in this piece of spot removal and plan to only use it for that. Totally fine. Lastly, the regen mode is also an interesting one. We're not a deck that wants to go really wide and then protect ourselves from a wrath. That's not the type of game we play. But even just like having this as a pseudo counter against spot removal, it can be relevant, and it's definitely going to catch some people off guard. But really, the priority of modes are just the order they're listed. It's at its best when it's sweeping up the weenies. It's really good as a flexible enchantment destruction, and the regen mode is pretty spicy and occasionally really good. Next up, we have Engineered Explosives. Now, this card is an absolute staple in Modern. I think it's really well positioned right now for the same reason Maelstrom Pulse is really well positioned right now. That said, this is perhaps one of the more controversial inclusions. A lot of people just won't play this card in a two-color deck because one of its big strengths is being able to set it on 0, 1, 2, or 3, realistically. And we can't hit the 3 mark. We just can't do it. Unless Thalia is around, in which case, okay, right? That's how Sunburst works, I think. Corner case. Anyway, I still really like it. I still really like this card. I like having a lot of 2-for-1 or more potential in this deck because, again, you don't need it to be perfect. Just like with the Ravs, you don't need to get everything they could ever possibly play. You don't need them to walk into the perfect Wrath or the perfect EE. You just need it to be good. Also, it gets an artifact in the graveyard for growing our Tarmogoyf, getting our Grimflayer, Delirium, etc. It's definitely a reasonable one. Moving on, we have Fulminator Mage, which, as I mentioned, has good applications against control, and especially good synergy with Liliana the Last Hope. This card also, even though it's a little counterintuitive, you're going to bring it in against, for example, Infect and Affinity, because it is the cleanest answer we have to those Ink Moth Nexuses a lot of the time. It's just kind of hard for them to play around this card. With Infect, their Spell Pierces don't do anything against Fulminator Mage. This guy is a 3 or 4 of in most BG Rock or Junder Absent sideboards right now. I'm only playing 1 because he's kind of the first on the chopping block as far as what most people are thinking for when Assassin's Trophy comes out. That may or may not prove to be correct in the long run. He's still really useful. But I'm essentially trying to get used to life without Fulminator Mage, but still playing as a perfectly reasonable one of. We'll see how that works out. Collective Brutality, we've already talked about this card. We do want 3 in the 75 for sure, but playing 3 in the main deck is a little much. So the third one's just chilling out in the sideboard, not much to say about. Here you'll bring it in against Burn, against Control, against Collected Company decks. That's worth mentioning. If you on turn 2 can escalate once, kill their Mono Dork, and take a Coco out of their hand, that is utterly backbreaking. That is taking away their acceleration and taking away their top end at the same time. Really, really good. Lastly, in this category, we have Choke. Now, Choke is an interesting card. There are a lot of people who will kind of poo-poo this selection and say, Choke is just too narrow, it's just not effective enough for how narrow it is. There is some truth to that. Then there are other people who say, blue-white control is tier 1. I'm going to play 3 chokes in my elf sideboard, let's say. I don't like that. Just in a deck like elves, not to pick on them, but they are extremely explosive, and their explosive nature is dependent on their synergy. They want the Heritage Druid and Mana Dork heavy starts into more elves and end the game quickly. They're not trying to take the game long, where Choke is really good. They don't want this card clunking up their explosive starts in their opening hands. So I think some of the criticism that people have of Choke in general is valid, but I think that Golgari and other BGX decks can actually use this card really, really well. Number one, we are trying to take the game long. We do want to grind them out, and that's where Choke really shines. Number two, we have the heavy interaction. We have Thoughtseize and Inquisition to take away their answers to Choke. We have Abrupt Decay and Maelstrom Pulse, and maybe even Golgari Charm to destroy their detention spheres if they try to detention spheres Choke. We have the ability to protect it. We want to take the game long where it shines, and we don't have. This does not particularly harm our synergies in any meaningful way. So I think a one of Choke in here is actually quite good, but not everybody shares that opinion. That is okay. Moving on, we have Kalidas Trader of Get. I love this guy. He's a little clunky, but man is he powerful when he gets going. He comes in creature matchups, in graveyard-based matchups, and even against Burn, because number one, he's got that lifelink. Lifelink on a 3/4 body, he's already looking pretty okay. Then he's got this replacement effect, so if an opposing creature would die, instead that's exiled. Let's not even finish reading the sentence, we'll just stop right there. The fact that we're exiling recursive threats, and we have a million ways to actually, kill them, and trigger this effect, that's really good. That's really good. A lot of the times against these graveyard decks, we can kind of stabilize, but we're just kind of spinning our wheels. Our kill spells aren't particularly effective. They're going to overwhelm us eventually. With Kalidas around, that is no longer true. Kalidas will get rid of those guys for good. And on top of that, we get a free 2/2 black zombie token. Now that is amazing value. This guy's a one-man army over time. As if that wasn't enough, you can cash in those zombies to make him bigger. Now, seems a little risky on paper, but you know what? Making the life linker bigger by +2/+2 every time you activate that ability, yeah, that gets out of control really, really quickly. So, gotta love this guy. Another value creature with some life gain attached is Obstinate Baloth. This is one of the least flashy cards, but I've grown to quite like it. 4/4 for 4, you gain 4 life. You gotta love the the symmetry there. But more importantly, perhaps, if an opponent makes you discard it, it just gets to go straight on the field. So against opposing Lilianas, this is amazing. This is one of the best cards in the mirror matchup. Even against Thoughtseize decks in general, sometimes it will be your only take, and you just get to blow them out. it also just kind of rounds out the sideboard nicely. Like, again, it's fine against burn, it's fine against aggro decks, depending on what else you have to bring in and out. You know, just having another value threat is, for a lot of matchups, is surprisingly good. Again, we interact so well that a lot of the time we can put the game away with this 2/2 man land. We can put the game away with an Obstinate Baloth. You know, we interact so well we can turn a ham sandwich sideways and eventually win the game. At least that's the idea. Finally, we have Nissa Vital Force. Now, this is one that I've seen in some lists, and I kind of, you know, my eyes kind of glazed over her. I didn't really consider her, and eventually I saw her enough where I'm like, huh, you know, she actually looks really good. 5 mana is steep. There's no getting around that. 5 mana is a steep, steep cost. However, all 3 of her abilities are actually pretty nuts in this deck. Let's start with the most obviously synergistic one, the -3, the grindy value of returning any permanent from the graveyard to the hand. That's just more recursion in a deck that's already filled with it. And again, this is kind of a form of card selection, which again, when I mentioned the Grim Flayer earlier, we do kind of lack that, so that's quite useful. Her +1 is actually really, really good too. She gets to come in with 5 loyalty, go up to 6, and while doing so, turn a land into a 5/5 and just get in there. So this is a clock that's really hard to interact with. Doesn't feel good in an attrition match for an opponent to have to fatal push or terminate or what have you a land. Doesn't feel very good. And even if they do, she can just do it again next turn. We also have to activate her +1 only once, and then she's in alt range. And that can get out of control really, really quickly. It's kind of like another tireless tracker effect, except much less mana intensive. So a lot of the time I would probably hesitate to just throw her away to alt right away, but it can be the right decision. And even if it's not, it's quite realistic to +1 twice, and then minus, and then she's still around. And so this card is quite powerful. Despite the steep cost, I think it is well worth it in grindy matchups especially. Now, finally, we have the Graveyard Hate. Now, this is a little unbalanced. A lot of people would play 2 Surgical, 2 Spellbomb, and I am the first to admit that that is probably correct. However, Nihil Spellbomb is an absolutely awesome card in this deck in my experience, and I'm just hedging toward the value a little bit more. So let's compare the two. Here we have a 1 mana artifact. Again, that type is relevant for Delirium and Tarmogoyf, but 1 mana artifact that you can crack to exile all cards from target player's graveyard. Now, that's relevant. We don't want to wipe the graveyards altogether. We don't want to play Rest in Peace if we're splashing white. We don't want to play Relic of Progenitus if we're not, because we depend fairly heavily on our own graveyard. Maybe depend is not the right word, but we derive a lot of power and value from our own graveyard. So the fact that this is a one-sided graveyard hoser is exactly what we're in the market for. And we can have this card replace itself after we use it, all for the low cost of 1 mana to play and 1 mana to replace it. Now, again, to compare to Relic of Progenitus, Relic is great. It can eat away at the yard from the turn you play it for free, and that's awesome. But against a lot of the graveyard-based decks in Modern, against Dredge, against Bridgevine, against Mardu Pyromancer even, they can have these really explosive turns where you need to clear the yard totally. Like, at any time you need to be ready to do that. So in a deck like ours that likes to, again, play kind of a traditional curve, we're not making a ton of mana, we're not really ramping at all. The notion that we have to hold up a mana forever, or we can't keep ourselves safe from graveyard based degeneracy, that just wouldn't work. So with Spellbomb down, we can curve out normally, and the worst case scenario is we'll still crack it and we just won't get to cash it in for a card when we crack it. Now, of course, ideally you want the card too, but sometimes you just want to be more proactive, play along the curve. Spellbomb allows you to do that. Um, I think 3 is fantastic right now. That said, Surgical Extraction is also fantastic right now, and again, it could be better to play a 2-2 split. Surgical, though, is a heavily misunderstood card. It's possibly the most overboarded card in Modern. A lot of people, newer players especially, are like, huh, I'm really tired of that control player tapping me down turn after turn with all those cryptic commands. I'm going to bring in my Surgical, I'm going to Thought Seize his cryptic on turn 1, and then I'm going to just get them all out of the deck. That's actually not a very good play, because generally you are putting yourself at card disadvantage when you do that. Now you might get lucky and their value target like cryptic, he's just got a 3 cryptic opener, so you get to really to hose him there. But that's kind of a Christmas Land scenario. Generally, you are going down on cards in order to pull something out of the deck, and that's a big deal. It really is. So this card, even though it attacks something in the graveyard and gets it out of the graveyard and then gets all the rest of the copies out of the graveyard and the deck and the hand and anywhere else, this is more of an anti-combo piece than an anti-graveyard piece. And we're already pretty well positioned against most combo decks. However, it's still a nice, kind of different form of interaction, and really the rise of Bridgevine is what makes this card more appealing and is why a lot of people now are probably playing too, because that deck can go off before you can even get your Nihil Spellbomb down. It can go off on turn 1, so if you're on the draw, Surgical Extraction is your only hope to stem the tide of the opposing nut draw of Bridgevine. So, I could easily see too. You could make an argument for or against most of these cards, honestly. That is one of the beauties of a fair interactive mid-range deck is you get to have a truly diverse sideboard. Um, you just have to know how to side correctly. It's a lot harder than it looks. Anyway, so just as a review, this is BG Rock, also known as Golgari Midrange, and we are interacting heavily with discard and with spot removal. And we are landing big, hard to deal with threats that can take over the game quickly. We've got a lot of flexibility in our interaction, and we've got some really, really powerful payoff cards. We've got a pretty good matchup against most of the meta. The worst matchups are Tron and Valakut decks. These are big mana decks that are really, really consistent. They're really resilient to interaction. Our discard is fine against them, but they play so many cantrips that they can just kind of top deck their way out of our disruption anyway. And the cards that they play when they get to their threshold of big mana often just kind of win the game on the spot. So those are the worst matchups, but against the rest of the field, we're not really much worse than 40-60 or even 45-55, and we have a lot of matchups that are more favorable than that, and against basically any deck in the format, we are going to get better post-sideboard. Just to cycle back to the big mana decks briefly, again, Assassin's Trophy, when that comes out, that might change that whole dynamic too. Certainly will against Tron, if nothing else. The card is going to be nuts. Can't wait. Cannot wait. But until then, this is what we're rolling with. And this is a deck I've had a lot of fun with and some really, really good results with, actually. So that about wraps it up. I hope to be uploading at least a few videos in the near future of this deck in action with my commentary attached. And yeah, that was my first ever video, like I said. I know it was a long one. A lot of people are in the market for that. Some people are not. If it was too long, I'm sorry. And let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your feedback. So thanks for tuning in. Keep your eye out on this channel for more videos to come, including some more talk, some more deck techs when the much vaunted Assassin's Trophy finally comes out. So thank you for watching. I hope all of you have a fantastic night. Get out there, play some fair magic, cast some thought seizes, turn the Goyf sideways, have fun.